Okay, our speaker tonight is an author. He's got some of his books here to sell, some great books. He's a blogger, if you know what a blogger is. I'm never quite sure. Well, no, I do know, actually. I'm not that ignorant. And he also describes himself as a tippling philosopher. But I don't think he's drunk yet this evening. He's just sticking to water at the moment.
Sharp attack.
Good. Jonathan has given us many fantastic talks in the past. Well, 2 to be precise. But they were really entertaining, and we hope that he won't disappoint us tonight. Although he's just had a grueling journey in the heavy traffic.
Did they feel like many?
Pardon?
Did my 2 talks feel like many?
No, not at all. Don't worry. We wouldn't keep on asking you back. He's written books on free will, on the nativity, and a collection of unholy questions. I think we are in for a great night, so please give a very warm welcome to Jonathan Pearce.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction. Tonight I am going to talk about quite a few philosophical arguments for and against God, the existence of God, and I hope you have your philosophical hats on. I'll try not to be too in-depth and aim this somewhere in the middle, so hopefully it's approachable for everyone. And the introductions have been fantastic, so you kind of know what I do. I'm a writer and a blogger, and I've written 3 books. Another book that I've been chief editor on, 12 Reasons to Doubt, is just about to be published by the James Randi Educational Foundation. A prominent atheist author has asked me to write a chapter on morality in an upcoming book, and I'm editing sort of 3 other books, so things are going really well at the moment. So I really appreciate being asked to come out this. The menu of philosophical treats for you tonight. First of all, we're going to look at the creation of non-God objects, which is pretty much everything other than God. Why would a perfect God create at all? So the aim of tonight is to start with the really big questions and narrow it down to the more precise questions. So start with why create anything at all. The next question will be, the next argument is an argument that Christians and Muslims and general believers use to argue for the existence of God, and it's called the Kalan cosmological argument. So that will be the second argument, and I will hopefully pick some holes in that argument. Third argument is, why don't we photosynthesize? So if God was all powerful and all loving, why don't we all just photosynthesize? Why do we have to eat things and cause pain and suffering? The fourth argument is about the creation of particular groups of people that have more likelihood to believe in God. So if God creates all of humanity and a certain group is more likely to access God's love, then surely that's unfair, i.e. God is not loving. And the final argument is the stupidity of the Exodus account in the Bible. So this is a particular going into the finer details of belief. One of those stories that everyone kind of takes for granted, but they don't necessarily remember it enough or know it enough to realise how completely ridiculous it is. So that's tonight's menu. The first argument. Now, can I just say, the stuff on the board, you don't need to read it. I'm sorry, it's not really there for you. Just so I can remember what I'm talking about. Because you lovely people are philosophical guinea pigs, because I've never given this talk before, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to go. Good luck. So the first argument, and I will kind of read this part, because this is the expression of the argument. So consider the concept of a God world. This is basically just God. God exists in the God world. It's perfect. Okay, if we presume that God exists, we can assume that God world could exist, since the act of creating the universe or any non-God object was a choice that was not born of necessity. So the argument goes like this. If the Christian God exists, then God world is a unique, best possible world. Okay? So imagine the normal Christian understanding of God before creating the universe. God world. Okay? It's a perfect place. If God world is a unique, best possible world, then the Christian God would maintain God world. Why degrade what has been created or what exists as a brute fact? God world is false because the universe, or any non-God object, exists. We're here, so God obviously didn't decide to continue in just God world. He created something, us. In conclusion, therefore, the Christian God, as so defined, does not exist. So that's a basic argument. I'm going to look at each premise and just test out your brain cells. So, if God exists, he is what's known as ontologically perfect. That means his existence. Ontology is the study of existence. His existence, or her existence, or its existence, is completely and utterly perfect. There is no better thing in conception than God. So what exists is God. And apparently then God decided to create whatever. The universe. Many universes. Whatever. So, if God alone exists, then the state of affairs is maximally perfect. You can't get more perfect than that. That comes from something actually called the ontological argument that Christians often use just to argue for the perfect existence of God. So, God world eternally sustains the highest overall ontological purity and quality. That means, as I said, you can't get better than that. But, that's a bit of a problem. Why then create? If you exist in total perfection, why would you degrade that perfection? So, God is morally perfect. He would know that existing alone, on his own, for eternity, would be the most perfect thing ever. In conception. You couldn't get more perfect. And he knows that, but still decides to create. Any creation would, by necessities, necessarily a degradation of that state of affairs. What that means is that as soon as something is created, the state of affairs of perfection and purity and moral perfection goes down immediately. So if we think about Christianity, the Bible says Adam and Eve. He knows everything in advance, by the way, but on most understandings of religion, God knows the future. He is omniscient. Some theists actually disagree with that, but the vast majority agree with it. So if he has full foreknowledge of the future, and he creates Adam and Eve, and he knows that Adam and Eve are going to be putting a foot wrong, eating a few bad apples, then, well, there's a question, why does he create them knowing that they're going to fall into sin? But he degrades his perfection by creating these people that he knows are going to fail. He tests them, they fail, he knows that. We all live in sin for the rest of the time, apparently. So, what is going on there? To suggest that God's business is about degrading things is kind of to take away the perfection of God. So the question that the religious people need to be asking themselves is, why would God create anything at all? And my argument here, actually this is an argument of someone called Justin Sheba, who is, if anyone is on the internet and knows the Reasonable Doubts podcast, he does a lot of counter-apologetics on there. He's fantastic. And it's a really good argument because it's so basic. You can forget about anything that happens in this world. Why create anything at all? You're going to be degrading perfection. And surely that's not something that God would do. So, God world is false because the universe or any non-God object exists. So therefore, the Christian God as so defined does not exist. No perfect entity would create something imperfect. It's that simple. So it's one of the most basic fundamental creation of anything. It's the most basic fundamental thing that believers believe of God. And yet that creation itself is incoherent with God's characteristics. And that is a really short that is a really short argument, the first one of the night. And actually, that's it so far. Does everyone follow that argument? And does anyone have any questions about that argument, or musings, or kind of scratchy beard moments? Anyone at all? Hands up. Wow, no questions. Oh, yep.
Okay. Yeah, we just need to switch yours off when this one is on. Okay. Where's the first hand? This here. Okay. Sorry, I'll come round that side.
Well, my belief is that we are all working to be as pure as God, and we have to work our way back to that.
Absolutely, but do you think we can ever be as pure as God? Because surely it would take God to be as pure as God. So is that eventuality remotely possible, that we could be that perfect?
I would say maybe 99%, but it's going to take a few hundred years. Yes, because I believe you live more than one life to learn different lessons and do different things.
Okay, that's interesting, because that's still an acceptance that you'd only get 99%. Even if God degrades perfection by 0.00000, almost infinite 0.1%, it's still a degradation of a perfect state of affairs. And it still really prompts the question of why the hell would God want to do that? Why is degradation of perfection in God's repertoire of desires?
I think we're using the wrong word in my mind.
And in fact, also what would follow on from that is you have God in timeless existence. So before the creation of space-time, there is no time. Everything's an instant. So God world is a world where God exists, but time doesn't exist. So actually, I'm not going to talk about this tonight, but there are some heaps of really interesting arguments about, can God have any kind of personhood, any kind of personality, any kind of desire, any kind of need, any kind of property of existence without having time? There's no change. Time is a measurement of change in many people's understanding. And without any of those things, you think of what makes you a person, your experiences, things you've gone through in your life, your decisions you've made. But in fact, there's no such thing as a decision in timeless existence. You've just got an instance of God, perfect, nothing better. Somehow there's a decision, which doesn't make sense anyway, to create. And there's a change of God, just God, to God plus universe. And that is a change, and change requires time. So even the act of creation and causality, cause and effect, requires time. Even the act of creation, it doesn't make much sense to a lot of philosophers and certainly physicists. So that's just something, but that actually wasn't part of the argument. But back to what you were saying, I think even if we're 99.999% as good as God in billions of years, we're still not as good as God. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with, I think proposition E1 would be good, according to myself. Because going with what the lady just said there, that it will only take God. We are obviously trying to achieve perfection up to the level of God. Mm-hmm. And it would only take God to help us to achieve that perfection. And that pretty much is almost a summary of what Christianity is. I don't know if that's a taboo word in this meeting.
No, it's good. It's good to have a variety of beliefs.
So pretty much right in the middle of the Bible, there is a verse that says, trust not in man, but trust in God. So to achieve perfection, we're not supposed to trust in man, not ourselves, not anyone else, but only in God.
Okay. Exactly the same problem remains to that, in that unless we can achieve ontological perfection as humanity, not just as one person, we're talking about unless everything that has been created, that includes dragonflies, tables, the clouds, cancer, malaria, unless all of these things can achieve ontological purity, God's creation is leading to a degradation. And if we can achieve that perfection, then you prompt a question as why does God create all the badness in order to get to the good? Because surely an all-loving God would scrap all that suffering and just create the good. There's another argument which I'll just run through really quickly. It's an argument against hell, right? You've got this line of people in the front are people that freely come to love God. Freely come to love God in this world. This second line of people rejects God. These people go to hell and they will burn for eternity in hell, or whatever your idea of hell is. They're in hell. God creates a world with both of these subsets of people in. Why doesn't he just not create that lot, just create the front row here? Create the people who will not suffer, who will still freely love him. So everyone freely loves God and everyone goes to heaven. That's an all-loving God. So when you talk about creating, you've got a whole lot of problems thrown in with degrading, suffering, evil that goes with that. Even if it's for a short time or a long time to work towards this attempted perfection, you've still got all that time of degrading God's ontological purity. That was an expression of quite a few logical arguments.
Okay, hold on a minute. If you want to say something, we need to pass the mic around. So I'll come back to you.
I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards as well. So.
Yeah, sorry. There was a bit where you were saying about the first row and the second row, and why God would create the second row, which seems to be doomed to burn in hell. Mm-hmm. And this obviously, one would have to go back to the origin of evil. And that's what we believe is the devil who was formerly Lucifer. And people ask, why did God not just destroy him immediately? And from the God we understand, if you are the boss of a company and someone stood up to you and you fired him immediately, everybody would suddenly be afraid to stand up against you again. But now God's logic was, let him take his course. For example, you're the boss. Let the man take his course and people see the end of what he's proposing. So he wanted love, he did not want fear. If he was to destroy Lucifer, he was going to be feared. If he was to leave Lucifer, eventually people would see the end of what Lucifer was planning and eventually love him and choose. And obviously, part of it is row 1 and row 2, which is final judgment. Sorry.
Before I forget, let me just jump in there. So the analogy would be boss of a company. Of course, if I was a boss of a company that knew the future, I wouldn't employ sales in the first place. He wouldn't even get through the round of interviews. So, and I would still end up creating these lovely people who come to love me because I really need their love. I want praise, or that there's some kind of relationship going on, so I can have that relationship freely, and they will freely love me. And those people who, bear in mind, I create in the full knowledge that they are going to sin and reject me, and I still create them. I'm creating these people knowing that they will reject me. I'm creating the world and the environment in which they will reject me, and I'm creating the very idea of DNA and the matter that makes their bodies, which will reject me, and yet I do it anyway. So I can cut all of that out and still get the joy of these beautiful people. Probably time for one more. Thank you, though.
I completely agree with your argument. Anybody with any intelligence, and he's supposed to be a super intelligent, imagine a man, he trains and becomes a beautiful cabinet maker. He produces absolutely perfect furniture. Why would he then deliberately turn around and produce some rubbish furniture? He wouldn't. If he could make perfect joints, he would continue. It would be nothing to him to produce one that's inferior.
Agreed.
A couple more people want
Yeah.
to make points. Okay, Ben, and then I'll continue.
A very quick one. Firstly, I am a humanist. but I find your argument unsatisfactory because it presupposes what is good and what is bad. It wasn't for you or us or humanity to decide that. If your argument is true, it was for the gods to decide what was good and bad. And you can't follow your argument without knowing what good and bad in that sense is or was.
Absolutely. Can I answer that? Thank you for that. That's a really interesting question. I would have to disagree because I didn't actually define good and evil. In fact, it's not important. It's not important at all. What's important is God is perfect. Whatever standard that is. And actually, do you know what? I've written elsewhere that perfection as a term doesn't make sense on its own. You can only be perfect for something. So a particular ball is perfect for a sport, or that shirt is perfect for what you want to get out of that shirt, whatever. So actually, intrinsically, perfection on its own, without any kind of context, doesn't make sense. But this is from a Christian point of view. So I can say that the Christians believe that God is perfect. So if they believe that God is perfect, ontologically perfect, then God is still, doesn't really matter how you define it, or it doesn't matter how you define good or evil. If God creates, either this is perfect, either the world we live in, non-God objects are perfect. If they are perfect, then this is a God world, perhaps. But then it means that God isn't the most perfect entity in existence. It means God plus the world is the most perfect. So actually you're degrading the status of God. So most Christians would disagree with that, because they're saying, well, actually, God isn't ontologically perfect. God and the world is we are ontologically perfect in some kind of way. But then you also have to argue that me stabbing someone in the arm with a knife is somehow perfect. So while there's an interesting point you raise, I don't actually think it affects this argument. But thank you for raising it, because it allows us to explore the ideas far more.
Did you still want to make a...
Well, it's really been made, yes. So I just wanted to say that, Jung was, he never rejected Christianity totally, or the relationship with the Creator, but he talked a lot about the opposites and about becoming whole being far greater than perfection. Perfection is only one side of the, as you've been saying, one side of the duality, the spectrum. So I think it's most unfortunate that this perfect word seems to be monopolised by the Christians. I really do. I'm not particularly Christian myself, but yes, that's not to make that point.
Thank you.
I remember your Jungian question from last time, and I went back and thought about that, and I was like, of course I did know what to... You asked me an interesting thing, I was like, I don't know too much about Jung, but again, you would have to argue that we are part of perfection still, and this kind of duality of God and non-God, if you like, is still part of perfection. We can debate what perfection is. But on Christian understanding, what I'm doing is undermining an argument, a Christian argument, or a theistic argument, from their point of view. So we can unpick these terms and say, actually, they don't make sense, but in a way, what we're doing is not unpicking my argument, we're actually unpicking Christians' understanding of their own God's argument. But thank you, some really, really interesting questions. I hope are you still following me? Us? People? Everyone? Right. Now, it gets easier after this. This is quite... it's a really easy argument, and it gets used a lot. There's a Christian apologist called William Lane Craig. He's very famous. Dean loves him. Very famous guy on in the world of theology, philosophy, and writing books and what have you, and debates. He wins a lot of debates, and he uses this argument. He's a Christian, and it seems very simple, but actually, I've written a 20,000 word paper on this, which I won't be sharing with you tonight. But I will try and share a couple of points, but I don't know how I'm going to come across verbally, because I'm very used to just on the computer. But the argument goes like this. Everything begins to exist has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. And you can add a couple of premises or the conclusion on there, therefore God. Okay, or some kind of entity that was caused the universe. Very simple, 3 lines. 20,000 words in 3 lines. I could have written more. First of all, let me talk about causality. I'm going to read you a little sort of completely made up story, just to explain the difficulty in causality. So with this is about causality. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. So things causing other things, cause and effect. Smith is driving along the road over the speed limit. He is tired due to a heavy work schedule that his boss has given him, and a deadline which meant a lack of sleep the night before, and he is late for a meeting. One of his favourite songs comes on the radio and he starts singing along to it. On the pavement, a drunk man falls over into a bin which the council had just put in place to improve the cleanliness of the town. The bin is knocked off the stand and rolls out into the road. Smith sees the bin late as his attention is distracted. He swerves to avoid it. At the same time, a boy trying to cross the road without looking. Smith swerves him and he has to do another swerve to miss him. Significantly the other way, hitting a pothole in the poorly maintained road. This sends the car out of his control and onto the pavement. Jones, who had been walking by, slips on some soapy water draining from the car wash he is walking past. Whilst picking himself up, he finds Smith's car mounting the pavement, which hits Jones and kills him instantly. What was the cause of that death? I'll tell you what, those no-win, no-fee claims specialists would have an idea of that. So, basically, causality isn't just, I push that, it falls over. That's a really simple view of causality. Causality is a really, really complex matrix of things acting on other things. And you can't unpick A hits B, B does this. You simply can't do that in this universe. Everything, even if I pick this up, what caused me to do that? Well, we go back to the whole free will debate and you're getting back to the Big Bang. So what you find that causality is a matrix of things that maps back to the Big Bang. In fact, causality is, I would argue, is one thing, not lots of causes and lots of effects. It is one huge matrix that expands over time. So when you're saying everything begins to exist has a cause, what you're actually saying is the universe is one big piece of causality. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause, and you're actually in a bit of a circular argument. Because your causality comes from the universe itself, and then you're applying that to the universe, saying it needed a cause. When all we know is that there is one piece of causality. Let me try and explain it like this. Time is, on a lot of understandings, not quantizable. That means you can't cut it up into bits. We all think there's an arrow of time. So, yesterday, the past was a past fact, the present is fact now, and the future is potential. That doesn't marry up very well with physics, and actually most physicists believe in something called the B theory of time, or block universe, or block time, which means we live in a 4-dimensional universe, and everything is fact, even the future. So if you're talking about free will debate, that just kills it straight off. Physicists believe it fits with special relativity much better. So this idea that time goes forward in an arrow is actually an illusion to humans, it seems. And also time is relative. My time is different from your time. If we were twins, it's a famous twins thought experiment. If we were twins, I stayed here with a clock in my pocket, and you went up in a space rocket near the speed of light, and you travelled around Mars and came back, and you had a clock in your pocket. Your time on your clock would be different when you got to Earth than mine, even though the same amount of time has elapsed. So time is relative. This is what relativity tells us. So when you're talking about everything begins to exist as a cause, you're talking about things beginning at a certain time, and you're imagining this linear understanding of time, but time isn't like that. You can't chop it up like that. So when you're talking about causality and time, let's talk about this table. This table here. When did this table begin to exist? Can anyone answer that question? Put your hand up. When did this table begin to exist?
It's always existed in a different form.
Okay, you beat me to it. Does anyone else like to answer that question? Not so cleverly. Yes.
It's possible that you're talking about the concept of table or actually the wood that actually made it. So if you want to say, well, the nominal actually was assembled together and glued and put all the screws and nails as a table, then you could say maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Okay. Thank you. That's a really interesting answer, because what table is a concept. It's a concept in my mind. It just happens to be the same concept in your mind because you've all grown up in the same society where we understand it's a table. A cat wouldn't think that's a table, and an alien that came down here wouldn't think it's a table, and someone from maybe Neanderthal times wouldn't, and someone from a different... I can see that's a chair, but someone from the Aztec civilization might not know what that is, or a tree stump might be a chair to someone, but not to someone else. So these ideas of labels, these things beginning to exist, the only thing that actually begins to exist is the label of table. All that matter has existed in some way, shape or form since the beginning of time. Unless you believe matter pops into existence, and we can get on to interesting talks about that, but we won't. This has, some people call it a transformative causation. So it transforms. So it used to be wood, and then before that it was some kind of carbon-based whatever. But then even, on your understanding of the label of table, when it was all screwed together, well, was it a table when 3 legs were on? If I shaved 28 molecules off that, would it still be a table? If I keep shaving off molecules, it is something called Socrates paradox, which says if you keep putting on grains of sand, eventually you have a dune, but when's it become a sand dune? And it's the same with everything. So we attach labels to things, but people say, well, things begin to exist, but it's really, really almost impossible to state that something begins to exist. And all that happens actually is we're trying to attribute our understanding to things which are basically abstract concepts. So what happens is that the only thing that begins to exist in this whole universe are abstract labels. And abstract labels, most philosophers would say, abstract labels are not causally active. They're causally inert, which means you can't have an abstract label in a cause and effect relationship. Which means that the only thing that began to exist, if this has all existed since the Big Bang, all this matter and energy in different forms, and causality you can't chop up, it's one kind of matrix, everything that has begun to exist is basically the universe. So what this says, again, we're going back to, the universe began to exist, has a cause. Well, it's just asserting that. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. It makes folly of that whole argument. And this, in philosophical terms, this is realism. Realism is the understanding that things, abstract things, really exist somewhere, against nominalism, which is what I would say, or conceptualism. These things only exist as concepts in our heads. Some of us may agree, some of us may disagree, but they are basically concepts. But nothing begins to exist other than, arguably, the universe. Now, if you say the universe is the only thing we know began to exist, and that's controversial. If we say that's the only thing we know that began to exist, you can't make a rule about that and apply it to itself. You can't say everything begins to exist has a cause, because we only know the universe is the only thing that began to exist, and then I'm just asserting the universe had a cause, and then I'm saying that again here, and then I'm saying, therefore it had a cause, therefore God. And all you're doing is just putting a rule of one onto itself and getting God. Do you understand what's happened there? There's loads of really complex philosophy can go into that, but essentially it's a circular argument. There's lots else to say about the calamity-cosmological argument, but Christians will use it time and time again, but what they need to do in order to make this work is assert lots of other philosophy, like Platonic realism and all these kind of things that they don't. They just throw these hide so many assumptions, very simple things, hide so many assumptions, but no one really unpicks what that really means. What is causality? And we think, what we do is we arbitrarily cut causal lines up. They aren't even lines, but we kind of cut that up and you say, do you know what? I'm afraid you drank too much last night, right? And you had a hangover today. So your hangover was caused by you drinking too much, young man. Of course, well, actually, that's built into loads of. Well, that's not what caused it. You know, you've got things that cause that, and if you take those things out, that wouldn't have happened. So therefore, they're necessary to the eventuality. And you'll find that there's a matrix of causality in the world which is necessary to getting to us to where we are now. And that plays merry havoc with this argument. So hopefully, I've shown you that a very simple argument that's used very often has at least a couple of quite big problems. There are loads more. There's about 13 I found with this. And William Lane Craig, who uses it a lot, has answered supposedly some of these, and he dismisses them. But actually, he doesn't do a very good job of dismissing them very well. So I think a lot of them still hold, and I think this is a problematic argument. Are there any questions on this argument?
Okay.
Everything begins to exist as a cause. The universe began to exist. One theory is that the universe didn't begin to exist, it's always existed.
Exactly.
And if it has always existed, doesn't that crucify your argument?
Well, I hope so. It's not my argument. I want this to fail. I want this to fail.
So are you happy with the theory that the universe has always existed?
Well, I'm not actually. I'll answer that. I'm happy with as many criticisms of this as possible. Right, this argument I don't think stands for lots of reasons. What you're doing is you're critiquing premise 2. Premise 2 is problematic. First of all, you're saying, well, what the theist is saying, the believer is saying, that the universe needs a cause, and the cause has to be God, because God himself is what's called a prime mover. So God being a prime mover doesn't need a cause. He's existed eternally as some brute fact. Well, if you can do that with God, why can't we do that with the universe?
Yeah.
And what's more, there's something called Occam's razor, which is a philosophical position that says, if you multiply entities needlessly, if you try and throw in lots of things that you need more explaining, then your answer is more complex and is less attractive than an answer that's simpler and does the same job. So Occam's razor would say, universe plus God that needs explaining is more complex than universe that needs explaining. Therefore, universe that needs explaining is a simpler, more elegant solution. But to the actual science, loads of one that I think is quite interesting. I don't think we've existed eternally in this form, because you would have problems with infinite regresses potentially. And I think things where you have big bounces, like loop quantum cosmology, for example, is one theory where you've got time starts at a big bang and it goes around and crunches at another big bang and time starts again. So you don't have this problem with eternal time going backwards, because it just restarts and restarts and restarts. And actually there's quite a lot of theoretical evidence for loop quantum cosmology, and in fact loads of really cutting edge sciences taking place on that. But you've also got multiverse theories, you've got loads of really interesting theories, quantum tunneling, all this kind of stuff, which, Lawrence Krauss came to speak recently in Portsmouth, and he's written a book, A Universe from Nothing. So he says the philosophical nothing, which is literally nothing, doesn't make sense, and actually there always has to be kind of something, some kind of quantum vacuum, and therefore you can get the universe starting from there. So there are loads of really interesting, and that's just another weakness in premise 2. The universe began to exist. When someone like Craig uses that, he goes to certain scientists and he cherry picks them. He says, I like that. That represents the scientific consensus. Therefore, the universe began to exist. But actually, that's outdated slightly in reality, and there's a lot more going on. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, hi John, just a brief one. Having heard William Lane Craig run this a lot of times, usually whenever he's challenged about the universe being eternal instead of God, he always quotes Sam Bordguth-Valenkin and says that they basically prove that any sort of universe must have a beginning, and it's not possible otherwise. Are you aware of any decent critique of that?
I think
I think the most obvious critique is that all three, Board, Guth and Vilenkin, are atheists. So if William Lane Craig's using them to get to God, it's not working with the people that are actually formulating that theorem. And actually, Vilenkin's working on theory at the moment with, it might even be Lawrence Krauss, I don't know, someone, basically to pretty much answer that. Vilenkin would say the universe began to exist, but that's really problematic. You know, to believers, that's like, yay! Oh, let's get on the internet and tell the whole world that a really famous physicist thinks that the universe began to exist. But that term, began to exist, is really problematic. What does it mean? And was there something, you know... One thing to say about what's called the VGV theorem, this theory, is that it says that inflation began to exist, not that the universe began to exist. So the universe is inflating, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In simple terms, we're inflating. And what that theorem, as far as I understand it, says is that the inflation began to exist. It can't actually make comments on whether the universe itself began to exist because physics breaks down. And as soon as you start making, at the Big Bang, at Planck time, really early time of the universe, as soon as you start trying to make conclusions about what was going on, you don't understand what was going on. There's a really good quote actually from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy saying that if you're trying to make claims on the beginning of the universe from what's called the singularity, when it all started, that literally, if you're trying to make claims on that, you don't really understand what's going on because everything breaks down and you shouldn't really be able to make claims. That doesn't really answer your question, but it's confusing, and you have to be a PhD in theoretical physics to really get your head around it.
Any more questions on this section?
Thanks again. I appreciate that we are using logic mainly to get to the... I don't know if we're going to get to the end. But the fact that you're saying if something exists, it has a cause, so the universe exists, so at the end...
Began to exist.
Began to exist. So therefore, the universe has a cause. From a humanist point of view, I think you're almost suggesting that you do not know. And from a Christian point of view, we are saying we know. No. Now, from a humanist point of view, you're probably saying we do not know because we do not have the facts. From a Christian point of view, we are saying we know based on faith. We have been explained to that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And for us, that's enough. And some people will ask, so for someone who believes in evolution, where did all that stuff that created the Big Bang? I know, you do not support evolution.
No, I don't.
Yeah, nor do I. So they'll ask, so where did all that stuff that created the Big Bang come from? And okay, they won't be able to answer. So they will ask us in return, so where did God come from? And we will say, you better ask him.
What you're doing there is you're smuggling loads of really interesting words like you have faith. I know this, but then you admit that you have faith. So you have faith that God created everything, and we have faith that science will come up with the answer. Okay? Now, let's think about this as a horse race. So, I have a horse called naturalism. And over the last 2,000, 5,000 years, it has won every single race. It is basically, we used to think God, lightning, God was angry. But then we found out really why that happened. Naturalism provided the answer. Naturalism has always won the race. Theism has never, supernaturalism has never replaced naturalism with an explanatory answer. Never in the history of the world. So if you're talking about faith, I might bring in probability here. If a horse has won 100,000 times in the last 10,000 years, and that horse's science will explain it, or naturalism will explain it, and I have another horse which is lost every time it's come up against naturalism for explanatory power, am I really just using faith? Or do I have probability? Do I actually have a fairly solid grounds to at least expect naturalism to come up with the answer? Because all you're doing is you're throwing in, God did it. The old, I don't know, therefore God. It's called an argumentum ad ignorantum. So argument from ignorance. So I'm not saying you're evil, but saying, because I don't know, therefore God. And that is not good enough. It's much, much better to remain sceptical and say, I don't know, therefore I don't know. And do you know what? I'm happy not to know. And I would put money on the stuff that is curing disease every day of the week, that is producing new technology. I'll put my money on that to find me the answer than a 2,000-year-old book that is compiled by unknown authors in unknown times and unknown places. So I think when you're talking about explanatory power and scope, I think science, which is testable, which is falsifiable...
Well, I've said this so many times before, I must be getting bored, but the problem is that the mentality of human beings is such that we cannot, well, most people cannot grasp a feature of something that goes on forever. The universe, in my opinion, is going to go on forever and ever. There doesn't have to be a beginning and an end. There's no end to a sphere. It's just a continuous process. But they say, oh, but God created this. He started it. There's no start or finish. I'll turn into elements when they bury me in the ground, and I'll come up as grass or a maggot or worms or a tree, and then that tree will die and decay until and it's continuous forevermore. But people seem to be unable to grasp that.
Thank you.
I think the only problem with what you're saying is the idea that the universe has existed eternally, infinitely backwards. And I think if I was to agree with William Lane Craig possibly on anything, although I'm undecided on this, he says that in order to have infinite time backwards, you've got a problem, because you've kind of got an actual infinite going on, which is philosophically very, very difficult. So I think at some point the universe, some kind of start has happened, but that might have been a reboot. So if you want to talk about that eternally, then yes, you
if
could
it's
say
a reboot, it's not a start.
Yeah. So in that case, I agree.
What's this problem with infinity? It's something which a lot of people have great difficulty in comprehending, but when you stop to think about it, it's very simple. You can go to infinity in every direction, in time and in space and everything else. There's no problem with it at all. See my book.
That's a really big question. Okay, there are two different types of infinities generally for. There's actual infinities and potential or theoretical infinities. So mathematical infinity, you're talking about understandings of infinity that are different from actual sets, so set theory, and basically, are there actual infinities where, say, I add in succession one onto another, and I keep going. Is there in this universe an actual infinite of something? Now, no one I know would... Some people would theoretically say there could be actual infinities, but most people that I know, mathematicians included, would say that there aren't actual infinites. But there are potential mathematical infinites, and they're different. So sometimes you get into confusions about infinity because one person's talking about equivocation over. One person's talking about potential infinites, and another person's talking about actual infinites. And we use infinity in mathematics all the time. So we apply potential infinites, but we don't use actual infinites, which is sets of things. And if you're talking about time, an actual infinite of time is a very, very difficult concept. If it's a linear straight all the way back, because it means there's no beginning, it goes infinitely backwards, so it gets into confusion of how we hear. But it's really interesting. I'm actually editing a book called Infinity plus God equals Folly. It's called ... Infinity plus God equals Folly, and it's by a PhD mathematician, and it's all about this. So I'd have to talk to you about that. But we probably don't get on. Not everyone likes infinity.
No.
Right, this one. Problem of evil. Everyone loves a problem of evil. Why is there suffering in the world? Okay, this is a good example of the problem of evil as a logical argument. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering, it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. What that basically says in a lot of words is there's lots of suffering. That suffering, if you've got an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, he can do something about it, he knows what to do about it, and he's loving enough to care to do something about it. Why is all this evil and suffering in the world? And the theist, the believer, would say, well, it has to be for a greater good. It has to be for a greater good. And the reason it has to be, because if it isn't, then God ain't very nice. And we know that God's lovely. So therefore, all this suffering has to cancer, malaria, deaths, molesting of small boys by Catholic priests, whatever you want to say, whatever horrible that happens in the world, it's got to be for a greater good. So, what the argument then becomes is, well, there's all this evil and suffering in the world. What is this greater good? And theists will say, they will come up with what are called theodicies. Theodicies are kind of excuses for God. Not excuses, that's a bit disingenuous. They are reasons or defences for God why evil might exist. So, for example, that I walk up to David and I mug him, run away, and take his money. How do we explain that? Well, God has allowed that to happen. How has he allowed that to happen? Well, if he didn't, maybe that is because free will exists. And in order for free will to exist, there's going to be some natural byproducts of that, of people being not very nice. So one theodicy is called the free will theodicy. So a certain amount of evil exists because if we've got free will, which is a really good thing, actually, incidentally, it doesn't exist. But if we did have free will, it is apparently a really good thing. And it has a natural byproduct where lots of people do very nasty things. So, that's just one. So most theodicies revolve around people and things about people. But some of the hardest things for believers to explain is why does a fawn, baby deer, die in a burning forest fire for a 3-day period, screaming in agony, doesn't help anyone, nobody knows about it, it's just there, agonisingly dying and suffering. Why didn't God stop that? And that's where the theist goes, that's a bit difficult. And there are answers, but I personally don't think they're very good. So, I always like the idea, and I wrote this in the Unholy Questions book, which is a set of questions I asked God directly, and incidentally he hasn't answered a single one yet, and there's 501 of them in there, so I don't think he's on the ball. Question number 282 is, my child stomped on the flowers the other day, all over the flowers. Now, if I punished him, hit him, maybe gave him cancer, which we know is a very nasty thing, very personal thing here. If I did something that horrible to him, but I didn't tell him why I was doing that, then that suffering that he has is, although it might be for a greater good in some, well, can it be for a greater good? If I'm not communicating to my child why I'm punishing them for that exact misdemeanour, then there really isn't any theodicy that you can give. Because that suffering, that punishment, is totally unknown to the child. They don't even know that they're getting punished. The idea of punishment isn't there. They're just, this bad stuff's happened to me, why? My dad has beaten me, why? I'm not telling you. So you get into real problems. And one real problem, see this as a punishment to the child. The child is humanity. Actually, it's not just humanity, it's the entire living world. The problem is this. Apparently God has designed the universe, or this world, to work whereby most organisms, or a lot of organisms, require the death of other organisms just to survive. So to survive, I've actually personally killed 2 chickens, but I have killed, by proxy, hundreds, maybe thousands of animals in my life. Every animal's done this that's a carnivore and or an omnivore. All of that pain and suffering since the beginning of carnivorousness, imagine it, all that pain, all that suffering. The religious person has to say that is for a greater good. What good could possibly come out of that? That's just shed loads of pain and suffering for no greater good, apparently. And we're not even told why. Nowhere does it say, oh, by the way, I invented that carnivorous stuff. You guys eating at each other. I invented that because X or because Y. You might get into Adam and Eve sinning, and this didn't happen before Adam and Eve fell. But there's actually no evidence for that, and in fact, there's evidence contrary to that. So we know that animals predated, as in they ate other animals through fossil records dating back well before humanity even existed. So we know that's just flat out wrong. So, the other thing to remember is the Christian or the believer of any faith will often come up to you and say, but, you know you broke your leg, and you know your uncle got killed in Afghanistan, and you know all these people that you know got malaria. Well, they're all going to go to heaven, and they're going to be repaid, and it's going to be lovely. Right? Really common move. Compensation is not moral justification, and that's so important to explain. It doesn't work. If I walked up to someone and punched them full in the face on the road and then gave them 10,000 quid, that compensation does not morally justify what I did. That pays for the discomfort, but it doesn't make it a morally good act. It doesn't make the act of punching that person in the face morally good. It has no effect on the moral value of that act. So heaven is not good enough to justify suffering on earth. And it's so common you see theists do this. Doesn't work. Don't let them do it. So, omni-God, he knows what to do, how to do it, and he's loving enough to do it. Why don't we photosynthesize? Why hasn't he changed some of the figures whereby we can derive energy enough from the sun that all organisms do not need to rely on the death and suffering of other organisms merely to survive? And to me, that's one of the most powerful arguments against the loving nature of God. I would have thought that would be fairly easy for a God to be able to do who apparently can do anything. It's not logically inconsistent. It's just a case of you make the laws of physics and biology, you can pretty much make that happen. And if you can't, you are not omnipotent. And if you can't, how about telling us why not? So that, does anyone have any questions on that?
With the first argument, the only problem I see from using it for explaining this to Christians is I don't think they would see carnivorousness as being an evil. I don't think their idea of good and evil applies to animals as it does to humans. I think they separate the two out quite dramatically.
It's an interesting point. All you have to do is ask yourself, is a universe whereby, or just a day whereby you kill 4 cows and they suffer horribly, imagine. Maybe you're ripping them apart with your teeth. Maybe you're a tiger. Yeah. Imagine a day where you rip something apart with your teeth, kill 4 animals, and they die horribly. I've seen a video on YouTube of hyenas killing a water buffalo, and it was so it was lions. So distressing. It was horrible, okay? And it's truly horrible. Now, if you can say, right, those lions could have got away with not doing that and had the same sustenance, what would you prefer? And intuitively, morally, and if we're made in the image of God and we have the essence and morality of God in us, if we see intuitively we would prefer the one without the suffering and death, then on what grounds do you have to say they're either neutral or the carnivorous one is better?
But why does there have to be suffering to kill the animal?
Well, again, good question. Come on, God, why does it have to
kill an animal without it suffering?
Yeah, they could, of course it could, but they don't. Have you seen the animal world?
It's a moral argument about death or undeath. But an animal isn't as self-aware as we are, so it doesn't think, I don't want to die. It would think, I'm in pain, I don't like this, not I.
Sure. Well, actually, the moral argument is being applied to God, not to the animals.
Sedated the animal and killed the animal, there's no suffering, so it's not a moral argument.
The moral argument is being applied to God, not the animals. So the moral argument is God has either designed that to happen like that, or allowed it to happen through evolution, theistic evolution. So if he's allowed that, or designed it, it's either permission or actual full-on active action. Is that moral of God to have done that? I'm not really interested in I'm not talking about all that line. I'm talking about God. Because if he wants all that suffering, it's what it appears like. There's huge billions of units of suffering have happened since the beginning of animal life on this planet. Either he wants that, or he doesn't. Either that provides basis for a greater good, or it's gratuitous. And if it's gratuitous, God is not all-loving. So either that suffering, and no, you're absolutely right, animals don't have to suffer when they're killed. Wouldn't it be nice if God made every animal that was a predator have a particular mechanism that, when they bit into them, some kind of venom paralysed them immediately and they couldn't feel anything and died? Wouldn't that be nice? Or God could do what's called perpetual miracles. So, because God's all powerful, so God could make it so that at every individual instance of animal death or predation, he just magically numbs their senses.
You don't know if he doesn't.
We do know he doesn't because of these screaming mechanisms and the pain reception, and we've measured pain reception in lots of animals. And what you're interested in, talk about the self-awareness of animals, of the higher primates and dolphins and things like that, and actually more and more animals we're finding are slightly more self-aware. There's a kind of almost a continuum of complexity with animals and self-awareness. So there are certainly at least some of those animals there. Chimpanzees going and killing other chimpanzees and eating some of their meat and stuff like that. These are self-aware and they do feel that, and God did design that or allowed it to happen.
Yeah, I'm getting to understand that it's almost like evolution is standing almost opposite of God in this. I mean, initially, I almost understood you don't believe in evolution. But the general premise of evolution is that everything is improving.
Can I answer that first?
Evolution is saying everything is getting better.
Can I answer that first? This is a really common mischaracterization of evolution. Evolution by natural selection, because there are different types, but evolution by natural selection will select in, I don't want to give evolution agency here, but it will select in attributes to organisms that will mean that in their given environment they are more likely to live to reproductive age or reproduce more. So, it doesn't make you better or improve you, it means that you are just going to be more likely to pass on those genes in that given environment. So take today's society. If you read the Daily Mail, you'll be like, oh, the social and economic demographics of Britain, all these poor people having too many children. Oh, these people on benefits having 8 children. Of course, from your point of view, you would be saying, well, surely society in Britain would be evolving to be better. Well, actually, you can argue that this society is evolving that people on a lower socioeconomic demographic scale are having more children and more likely to pass on their genes. So in fact they are fitter than more intelligent, more educated people who have less children. We know there's a link between education and childbirth rates. So actually the people that are more fit to their environment are the people that are kind of worse off or less fit by the kind of criteria that I imagine you might be going for. So evolution certainly doesn't say we would improve, because that means you have to have some kind of independent benchmark about goodness.
I need to apologize on sitting on someone's chair that I don't belong to. I really don't know enough about evolution. So I'll take your word for it.
Can I jump in there? One thing to say to that. I really appreciate your honesty. Thank you so much for saying that. It's beautiful. All I wish you'd say next is, I don't know enough about evolution, therefore I don't know enough about it to deny it.
I do know a bit. I mean, just the smallest to go by.
Just the smallest to deny it.
No. Just to suggest, I know Charles Darwin himself had his doubts.
No.
I have... Sorry. I mean, that's just my opinion. Could be wrong. There are scientists, evolutionists, who have had a problem. They've said it doesn't really stand. There are too many gaps that are filled in with air pockets.
Stop. You've got to stop there. You've got to stop there.
Can I suggest we come back to the topic of
Okay, yes. Okay. Let me go back to what I really wanted to say. What I wanted to say, I think this is a chair I can sit on. Christians believe that things are getting worse. We believe that.
Can I disagree with that straight away?
I thought you were not a Christian.
This might interfere. If you read Stephen Pinker's latest book, we all think, if we read the Daily Mail, things are getting worse. Actually, the human rights is better than it's ever been in the history of the world. We're getting less violent. Crime rates arguably are going down. We're killing less people in individual wars. We are in a better place for world equality than we ever have been. There are so many ways that we are getting better and better that people forget to think about. And they read the Daily Mail and they think we're getting worse and worse. But by goodness, would you prefer to live in the Middle Ages than now? Would you prefer to live where you're going out and living in subsistence in Neanderthalic times? Would you prefer to live where there were no human rights? Would you prefer to live where there wasn't even a legal code? We have so much that is so much better than it ever has been in the history of this world that I find it really annoying, no offence, when people say we are getting worse, because it's a real one-track, poor idea of what is really going on. The one thing that is getting potentially troublesome is population. So if you there are too many people in too small an area, and that can cause social unrest, social demographic, people fighting for scarce resources. So if you want to talk about anything, talk about family planning. Talk about environmental protection. Talk about how we can make it better, rather than spending a lot of time saying how things are getting worse. Sorry, Karen.
Okay, very quickly. This time I'll try and... Okay, well done. Thank you for that answer. I'll try and complete my sentences. I think, from my understanding of Christianity, it says that God created a perfect world. And from the time that Adam and Eve sinned, that's my premise, I apologize for it, but I say it with confidence nevertheless, that he created a perfect world. And once Adam and Eve sinned, from that day on, he placed a curse and said, from now on, the earth will be a burden to you, and you yourselves will have ABCD curses. And from that time on, this curse has been passed on even to the animal kingdom. But to prove to you that animals were not carnivorous, going back to your statement up there, we have an understanding that the lamb and the leopard shall sit together, the lion and the sheep will sit together in the new earth. So right at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, carnivorousness, as you put it up there, did not exist. everyone was either vegetarian or was eating something in which nothing suffers. I'm a vegetarian because I don't want something to die for me to have lunch. So I would suggest that carnivorousness is not God's plan. That was only after sin, and that was a result of sin. When a baboon has the long fangs, it's a vegetarian. I say that. So
Okay.
they're not designed to be carnivores.
Two really quick things to say to that. Evidence shows that you're wrong about carnivores as not existing prior to Adam and Eve. But actually, evidence doesn't. Adam and Eve didn't happen. You know, we can the bottlenecking of DNA. There's so much evidence to say that Adam and Eve didn't exist. Okay, so that would take too long to talk through, but it's just a disagree. But the biggest thing about what you said is that you said God created a perfect world, and then Adam and Eve bugged it up. Of course, a perfect world, Adam and Eve wouldn't bugger it up. So he didn't create a perfect world. That's all I'm going to say to that, really. Next one possibly. Oh.
It's more add-on. The idea that like lions or lambs could live together, it's impossible. Assuming lions were created at the same time, and they're looking at the lions like we actually see today, their bodies are actually made to process meat. They won't be able to eat meat. They'll die. They'll starve. And that actually is not going to, for example, like vampire bats, which actually the illicit cubes are actually just a pixie that actually are cloud and nothing else. That's the only thing they can live on. So he either create them as an afterthought after the Adam and Eve incident, or he started from the beginning.
There is literally mountains of evidence to go along with what you're saying, and you know it's about with belief. It's about psychology. I can produce as many arguments as you like. These people are like, oh that I agree with that because I want to agree with that, and you'll be like, no, I don't agree with that. And it comes again in psychology, and the arguments are irrelevant because we have confirmation bias, and confirmation bias means that I'm more likely to ascribe greater value to evidence that agrees with what I say, and less value to evidence that I disagree with. So when you're looking at the evidence of Adam and Eve versus not Adam and Eve, you and myself as well will be ascribing different evidence value to the different sides of the argument. The problem is, I've got science on my side. So I've got a testable, falsifiable, self-correcting knowledge mechanism with thousands of years of pedigree. And what has religious theology added to this world in the last 2,000 years? And the answer is, what is science as a knowledge method? I'm not talking about the body of evidence, I'm talking about method. What has science added to the world in 2,000 years, and what has theology added to the world? And there's a massive gap, and that's basically all I've got to say. So it's a psychological thing. And I would just advise, obviously, that you do honestly check out the opposing evidence to everything and treat your own views sceptically. Because I think everyone knows that to themselves. We've got to go on to the next one, mate. We'll talk after.
I'm just rushing off.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your questions. Really interesting. Thank you. Right, we're going to have to really rush through this. Okay. So there are lots of studies that say certain amounts of people are less or more or less likely to believe in God. So, for example, and this is one that I had some argument with someone actually on the Dorset Humanists Facebook page some time ago. There's a set of pieces of research that say autistic people are something like 90% less likely to believe in a personal God. And men are less likely to believe in a personal God than women. Actually, men are more likely to be autistic than women. So there's probably a connection there. Scientists are less likely to believe in God. Men are more likely to be scientists. Autistic men are more likely to be scientists. You know, there's all these kind of connections, but you've also got other ones that say, for example, instinctive thinkers are more likely to believe in God. So I think someone in here knows someone that runs the Epiphenom blog. Is that someone in here?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's Tom Rees.
Tom Rees, yes.
Yep.
So he actually blogged about that piece of research. So people that have instinctive ways of thinking are much more likely to believe in God, which is what actually fits very well with this, because actually these are more about non-instinctive ways of thinking, sort of really, I hate to use the word rational, because I don't mean to say men are more rational than women and stuff like that, because it's not that simplistic. The idea being, of course, that if you've got a subset of people on earth that are more likely to have access to the love of God, God's not fair. Remember, compensation is not justification, so you can't balance this up in heaven. Right? This is unfair on earth. If our job as created beings is to enter into a loving relationship with God freely, and I'm in a subset of people that is predisposed not to access that love, then that is inherently unfair for me. Even if it's one person in the history of humanity that has less chance of accessing that love, it's unfair. But we're actually talking about billions. So, really quickly run through that. I'd love it if no one had any questions. It's basically, do you understand the concept? If a group of people are less likely to love people for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter what the reason is, then God's not fair. He's not all loving. Because he's not. There you go. Right.
Jonathan, can I just add one?
Yeah.
Sorry. I just want to add one biblical quotation there. Paul in Romans says that God hardens the heart of people he wants to harden. So
that's a beautiful segue into this next section. You may come to realise in a minute. Oh, that's just delightful. What a great interjection. Okay, I'm going to read through very quickly. This is for me, not for you, but you're welcome to read it. This is the story of Exodus. So we're talking about Moses and Aaron taking the slaves out of Egypt. This is a totally core piece of biblical literature, which actually is a foundation pretty much of the New Testament as well. And it's so important that if it's completely not true, you've got problems. And it's completely not true. Therefore, you've got problems if you're a Christian. Luckily, he's gone. Anyway, so let me just remind you of the story. So Jacob and sons, I'm not going to break out into song here, by the way, and families moved to Egypt. They numbered 70. Remember this number, it's pretty important. Jacob was the father of Joseph, who was sold into slavery. Remember Technicolor Dream? Well, it wasn't Technicolor, technically. It was just a code. And he got sold into slavery, but remember he rose up, he translated some dreams, he rose up to be second in charge of the whole of Egypt. He was super important, everyone must have known him because he translated dreams and he had all this, and he was your big second honcho. So, the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly numerous, so the land was filled with them. They started to populate Egypt with Israelites, as Exodus says, even though the term Israelites didn't exist then actually, they weren't Israelites, but that's a bit of an anachronism from the Bible. A new Pharaoh took up office and did not know Joseph or his brothers at all. So your first problem is, hang on, you've got the new number one that hasn't got a clue who the old number two was, who translated loads of amazing dreams and saved Egypt from starving by building granaries, 7 years fat cows, 7 years thin cows. He basically single-handedly saved all of the Egyptians' lives from famine. So apparently no one remembers him though right afterwards. So there's your first problem. He saw all of these Israelites and got worried. Seemingly in one generation, this is a pharaoh or so, they were that numerous that he said, they only started off at 70, now they're pretty numerous. He said, behold, the people of Lord, the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. 70 people in a couple of generations. What's going on there? Thus the Egyptians enslaved all of those Israelites who were already numerous, just like that. So I don't know how you would go about enslaving people suddenly who were that numerous. If they really were that numerous, that's a massive undertaking. So you've got huge problems for this. Bear in mind there's absolutely no historical evidence for any of this. Just throw that one out there. There's no archaeological evidence for the Israelites ever being in Egypt. There's one mention on a stela, an inscription referencing the Israelites later, but there's no evidence for any of this ever happening. The Pharaoh dictated that all firstborn Hebrew children should be killed and thrown into the Nile. So, actually, if you wanted to control populations, you would kill off the females. So, first of all, that's a pretty stupid thing to do, because it's the females who give birth. You can have one male. You'd have a pretty difficult job. But you can do it. So he went and killed all the firstborn sons. That was nice of him. Moses is born, and for 8 months his mother conceals him before sending him down to the river for the Pharaoh's daughter to find him and bring him up in secret. Moses murders a man and runs away. He talks to a burning bush. He has his son's foreskin cut off and touched to his feet or genitals, we're not quite sure. This is because God was going to kill Moses, and his wife suddenly cuts off their son's foreskin and touches it to his feet, and thus saves Moses. People forget this. That's rather weird. Remember this God, creating, all-powerful, all-amazing, beginning of the universe. He says, one of the most important stories that's going to happen for my chosen people in a couple of billion years is going to be, I'm going to kill Moses, but then suddenly I'm going to change my mind. Changing my mind doesn't make sense because you have foreknowledge anyway, so that's inconsistent. I'm going to change my mind, but I'm only going to do that because his wife cuts off the end of his son's penis and touches it to his feet or genitals, I'm not sure. Really? Too much of that wrong to go into. Anyway, Moses returns to Egypt and does some magic tricks taught to him by a bush. And with the help of his much better public speaker brother, Aaron tells the Pharaoh to let his people go. You've got to remember here that the magicians of Pharaoh matched him trick for trick. Now this is interesting. Moses and Aaron do magic stuff, like turning the Nile blood red and all this frogs and stuff. But apparently the magicians do it as well. So God is either allowing them to do magic, i.e. giving them the magical powers themselves, to set up some kind of weird situation, which means their free will is being interfered with completely, or we can actually do magic. We literally, if we wanted to, could find a way of turning the Nile into frogs or something. So that's a bit weird. Now, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Moses says, please let my people go. God hardens his heart. This assumes that he would have done otherwise. Basically, the only way to understand this, well actually it could be two things. The Pharaoh could have said no, but God didn't know that. So he was just in case, but then that would invalidate his omniscience. Or he was going to say yes, and he changed his mind to say no. In which case, God is interfering with free will and setting up a situation where there's going to be heaps of pain and misery and plagues, which could have been easily averted because the Pharaoh was actually going to be a nice guy anyway. So this is a completely, I don't want to swear, unfair thing to do. It rhymes with dastardly. Then the plagues come. Now, these plagues are actually pretty horrible. We remember the plagues fondly. Oh, I remember the Egyptian plagues from RE lessons. Yeah, frogs and gnats and boils and firstborns dying and all that. Yeah, that is horrible. Okay? Diseased livestock. There would be famine coming from this. Locusts, darkness. None of this we've got evidence for. Well, there's some interesting naturalistic explanations. So, is an all-loving God likely to have killed off animals? What have animals done? Livestock. What about the children of these families? They've got nothing to do with Pharaoh. Just because Pharaoh said no, which God made him do, you've got children being killed. You've got the firstborn dying. You've got people dying in famine. This is horrendous. This is a really horrible story. The Israelites marked their own doors as a symbol to the angels of death to pass over. So they mark their houses with the red blood, don't they, of the goats? Because, of course, God doesn't know where they live. And his angels that he sends down, they're not very clever, so they need that sign. So that's lucky. This is a little known, I should say, oft swept over event. This is really, I didn't know this till recently. God softens the Egyptians so that the Israelites, they're just about to run away, the Israelites, right? It's all in secret. Firstborns have just been murdered. Yay! Yay, murdered children. They're all like, brilliant, this is our chance, all those children are dead. So we're now going to go away. But just before we go, I wouldn't mind some silverware. But God gets involved. He's like, well, actually, I think that's not a bad idea, because you're going to need that in the wilderness. So, Tesco are building some shops there, probably. So I am going to, in my omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving status, going to soften the Egyptians' hearts, and I'm going to let them into your house, let you into their houses, and you can steal what you like. So just before they go, they run off with articles of gold and silver and clothing. The Lord had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. We learn at school that the Vikings weren't very nice when they plundered. But the Israelites, they're a nice bunch. They were chosen. So, 430 years since the day that they came to Egypt, the Hebrews, or the Israelites, they break free and run off. Now, there is some contention over this, but the general translation of the Bible is that there are 600,000 men armed for battle. Now multiply that with women and children and livestock, wandering around the wilderness without a Scooby-Doo where they're going for 40 years. That's something like several million people. A, how did they get that many people? B, how do you wander yourself around a desert for that long and get lost? C, what are you going to eat? They took Joseph's bones with them, so apparently everyone did know where Joseph was. But they're just running off. Hang on, I'm going to dig up Joseph. So 2 million people. So in order to kill that, Pharaoh has to have a massive army to go and chase them. And they run after them, and they get destroyed in the Red Sea, which we now think is actually a mistranslation, the Reed Sea. So that's not very nice. And then we have these 2 million people wandering around Kadesh Barnea, this sort of wilderness area, apparently eating manna and surviving for 40 years. Now, just walk in a straight line. And actually, if you had that many people walking single file, you would stretch the entire area. And we have found in that area evidence of contemporary Bedouin tribes, maybe 40, 50 people. We found archaeological evidence of that. However, we are somehow unable to find any archaeological evidence of 2 million people hanging around for 40 years in a desert where everything gets dried and preserved really, really well. So, this is clearly nonsense. They come out of the Sinai Peninsula to take over cities and take their homeland away from the Canaanites, which is very nice. There's no evidence for that. Very, very scant evidence for any of that. The battles of Joshua, Jericho, all that kind of stuff. Hugely problematic. The problem is the people who did the archaeology in the last 200 years were Christians, paid for by seminaries. They sent them out there and they used the Bible as the archaeological basis and the pillar of knowledge. So they said, we found this bit of pottery, that must be, that's King David's time. So therefore every other bit of pottery and every other bit of strata refers back to this time, which is presupposed in the Bible. Now people like Israel Finkelstein, and if you read books like The Bible on Earth, are changing that. The new generation of Syro-Palestinian sort of archaeologists are changing that up, and they're saying, you've got to scrap this. The reason why you think that archaeology supports the Bible is because your whole framework is hogwash, and it totally needs to be rewritten. So they're coming in now and saying, well actually you thought we had lots of evidence, but actually there is zero evidence, or very little evidence. Maybe the occasional biblical character, biblical person or place that's mentioned has a gate. That. But as for the characters and what happened in the coming out of Egypt, none at all. And basically, if you believe all of that, each one of those points has a massive issue. If you believe that, then you're a brave person in my books. That is the foundations of the Bible, the Torah, the law, which Jesus came to fulfill in every jot and tittle. And it's the Ten Commandments come out of that. And that is all nonsense. In fact, I forgot to say, Moses going down a river in a basket is stolen from the Mesopotamian king Sargon I, I think. If you know your Bible history, the Israelites actually went into exile, Babylonian exile, around 600 BCE, 600 BC. They went into Babylonian exile, and they found themselves out of their homeland with no kind of culture. And this is where critical people now think the Bible was written, predominantly when they were in exile, because they needed to invent their history and their culture. So this came out of nothing. What they did is they stole from the surrounding cultures. So Moses going down a river in a pitch basket. Pitch, by the way, wasn't found in the area at the time, so we know that that's a problem. That story is identical to King Sargon from Mesopotamia, from the Babylonian exile period. They would have stolen that. So things like that, you've got their big signposts saying, hang on, this ain't real, this didn't happen. So just a bit of history and archaeology to round off the philosophy, just to show you that the whole gamut of religious claims don't make sense, from the philosophical to the scientific to the historical. And I hope you've got some degree of understanding of why we should be dreadfully sceptical of most things people tell us, unless there's a good scientific consensus which is born out of falsifiability and testability and self-correcting methodology. Thank you very much for really bearing with me in a long, hot night.
We have 5 minutes left. Woo! Any last questions? I'm going to wrap it up in 5 minutes. You were first. Let me come round to you.
Well, that's really interesting because I'm actually Jewish, but would you say that also applies, do you think, to the Christian Bible?
What do you mean by that? Do you mean that kind of historical approach to critically analysing?
Yeah.
So the Christian Bible, do you mean the New Testament? Because obviously the Christian Bible assimilates the Torah as the Old Testament, the Tanakh. We need to apply historical methods to the New Testament. The New Testament says lots of miracles happened. Someone was born. They were God. They did this, and this miracle. Okay. I would use a mathematical approach called a Bayesian approach to this. And this says, without getting too complex, it says if you have an extraordinarily improbable claim, a claim that has a very, very low prior probability, that means that of all the claims of other gods, we don't believe them. They're all rubbish. So the prior probability, without looking at the evidence, is that this claim is also going to be rubbish, because all the others have been rubbish so far. So it's got very low prior probability. Now, in order to be justified in believing this, something has to balance that low prior probability, and that's called a consequent probability, and that is the level of evidence you have. So in order to get that from being a low probability up to a high end probability, which I want to believe something that is the most probable explanation of the data, you have to have exceptionally good evidence. And this is actually borne out in a maxim: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I said to you, I've got a cat, you would go, no. If I said to you, I've got a cat that I keep in a bath, and I also keep my pet gerbils in there, and I feed them on Rice Krispies, you would go, I might need someone else to tell me about that. If I said to you, I've got a cat, it lives on the back of a dragon, and every Tuesday afternoon it flies to Jupiter and back, and also sings the national anthem on piccolo, or whatever, You go, that's nuts, that's clearly insane, that's highly improbable, I need video evidence, I need expert corroboration, probably need to see it myself, blah, blah, blah. It's exactly the same. All those claims of the Bible, Jesus doing this, resurrecting, all these highly improbable claims, they have to have extraordinarily good evidence to support them. The problem is the Gospels were written by people we don't know, in an unknown time, and with completely unknown sources. We don't know who their sources were. We know the historical methodology of the writers was very poor. The contemporary historians used better methodology than they did. So there's all sorts of unknowns, and they had an agenda. They were evangelists. In fact, they were called evangelists. So, and we know that Matthew and Luke relied on Mark, and John was just well out. So that's called the synoptic problem. The first three are quite similar because they all rely on Mark. John, bonkers, does loads of stuff that the others didn't because it's written a lot later, and he wants to invent his own theology. So as an independent person, I've got to look at all the religions in the world. I've got to take myself out of being brought up in a Christian country or Jewish country, and I've got to say, right, all these other claims, similar claims to this, are wrong in the world, and actually Christians believe they're all wrong. Are they applying the same methodology to their own beliefs? Because I've got to do that. I'm going to apply really rigorous methodology to this. Who wrote this? Blah, 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 blah. And the end result is the evidence is poor. There is no way that evidence is good. And in order to get that up to a high probability, you have to have faith. And often you have to have a personal experience of God. Oh, I saw a vision, I did this, I prayed and this happened. But we know that happens to everyone in every religion, and all religions can't be true. Unless you're a postmodernist. So, you've just got heaps of problems. So, a really good question, very long answer. The idea is that no, the New Testament doesn't bear argument.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. If you'd like to hang around and talk, and so Jonathan will hang around for a little bit longer. Don't rush away. There are lots of leaflets and things. If you want to know more about humanism and atheism, don't forget to sign up for my 6-week course. It's the answer to the Alpha course. It's called One Life, and it only costs 15 quid, or even less if you pay soon. So do hang around, and another quick round of applause for Jonathan. We've still got tea and coffee at the back. Pop a quid in the box. Don't forget, there's also a little bowl by the door. If you can be generous, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Don't forget these wonderful.
Jonathan has some great books here at the front as well. So half with your money.
Additions to your life. Reading this long and gone.